Thank you so much, everybody. Welcome to the fourth part of the South Shore Science Festival. Today we have a special guest, laureate Professor Peter Doherty. He's talking to us directly from Melbourne, Australia. We are 14 hours time difference. He's already on Sunday morning, so it's almost like a time travel as well. He's talking from Sunday morning. We're back here in the Northeast, and Saturday night. And we'll have people from Mexico as well, joining a couple of people from other places. Thank you. Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time, Dr. Doherty. And also, I'm going to ask probably for a second to introduce Ed Shapiro, who has been helping us to connect with you ourselves, as many of other Nobel laureates. If he can give a couple of words before we start, is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine, sure. Whatever you want.
Go ahead.
All I would like is to say hello to Dr. Doherty, and who is in Australia, and express our deep gratitude to this remarkable person and his friends in both countries, in Australia and the United States, all over the world, and express our gratitude to the Quincy Science Festival and its organizer, Manuel Barroso. With all this, we would very much like to greet you and welcome you to our great family here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, so so I'm a research scientist, and I work on what's called the killer T cell. These are the assassins of the immune system. They go around the body killing off cells that are modified in some way by a virus infection. Viruses only grow in living cells, so these cells kill off the cells that are growing up the virus, and they kill off the cellular factories, and they're really important in ending the infection. Now, I started my life as a veterinary scientist. I went to, as one did in the British Commonwealth countries. I live in Australia, so it's part of the British Commonwealth. I went to veterinary school straight out of high school. I was just 17 years old. By the time I was 22, I was trained as a fully trained vet. And I soon ended up in a research laboratory working on infections of domestic animals, cattle and sheep and pigs. And I spent 10 years doing that, both in Australia and then in Scotland, in the city of Edinburgh, and did a lot of interesting stuff there. And my career's always been focused on infection, and particularly on viruses. Now, what happened, and I've worked on latterly, and I'm known for, and I won the Nobel Prize for our studies of immunity. Immunity is our defense against infection. It comes from the Latin term immunus, which means without tax, which refers to some of the Roman soldiers in ancient Rome, who, when they came back from the war, were exempt from tax. Now, they were members of the Genio Immunium, who answered to the goddess Minerva. And the tax that immunity takes away is the tax of infection, which, as you know, it can kill us. So basically, I've worked all my career on what we call adaptive immunity, and that is the immune response that we stimulate with vaccines or with infection. There's another type called innate immunity, which is a very rapid response system, cuts in right at the beginning. It's very important in actually setting up the adaptive immune response. Now, when we're vaccinated or when we've had an infection, what protects us against reinfection is the antibody molecules, these molecules shooting around in the blood. And any infection that's in the blood, and COVID, the SARS-CoV-2, gets into the blood and goes around the body in the blood, like measles or polio, which also go around the body in the blood. Our vaccines can work very well against those. And it's great that the COVID vaccines work really well. Now, I don't work so much with that part of immunity. I work with these killer T cells. That's what we got the Nobel Prize for. You can see us all setting up on the stage here in Stockholm in 1996 to get the Nobel Prize. The first three guys are all the physics prize winners. Alfred Nobel, when he set up these Nobel Prizes, reckoned that physicists were the smartest people on Earth, and so he had them first. And if you've known any physicists, you'll know they think they're the smartest people on Earth. And then there's the chemistry guys, and then two of us for medicine, one for literature and one for economics. The Peace Prize is awarded in Oslo. This is all in Stockholm. Peace Prize is awarded in Stockholm. Peace Prize winners, it's rather political. They're selected by the Norwegian Parliament. Now, what did we get the Nobel Prize for? We got the Nobel Prize for, watch that little green cell up there. It's going to kill that big cell. Okay, watch it. Bang. It's disrupted the membrane of the cell. The red dye in the medium around the cell is flooded in, and that cell's killed. So if that cell was infected with viruses and was producing viruses, that would stop it. It would be like having a factory that makes munitions in a war and dropping a bomb on it and it blows up. So that's what happens. And what happens is that the T cell receptor is recognizing a tiny bit of virus presented in some surface molecules, which you call the transplantation antigens. And it's for starting that whole story off about how these cells recognize other cells that we got the Nobel Prize. So the Nobel Prize immediately, here's a picture of it. This is a structural biology picture where we can see the T cell receptor up the top, and then a little bit of peptide, and then it's recognizing the peptide in the groove of the transplant molecule. It's the really complicated stuff. You likely learn about it at school or in biology, and there's no time to explain it here. Now, after you win a Nobel Prize, you become prominent on the public stage. You're giving a lot of public lectures. It's the only thing in science that really attracts a lot of attention in a regular way when someone wins a Nobel Prize. And so as a result of talking a lot on the public stage, I also got a lot involved in eventually in talking about climate science and the sustainability crisis that we've got coming at us. So all the time that COVID's going on and we're dealing with this crisis of infection, which we'll get through because we'll get through it with vaccines, we'll get through it because lots of people have been infected, 2 or 3 years, we'll be through it. But with climate change, of course, we're not going to be through it, and it's just building up all the time because it's a cumulative problem, the accumulation of greenhouse gas problems, and the Earth will continue to warm. So this is the biggest challenge really facing us, a bigger challenge than COVID. And it's great to see President Biden really getting active on this. There's just this week, there'll be a Nobel Summit in Washington with the Nobel Foundation, the 3 national academies in the United States. These are the top senior scientists in the United States in science, medicine, and engineering. They'll all be getting together to discuss this climate change problem, also something on COVID. And I'll be talking on that with Tony Fauci and with Jennifer Doudna, who just won the Nobel Prize for CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, if you know what that's about. So as a consequence of being on the public stage, I've spent a lot of my last years, I'm now 80 years old, in doing public communication. I've written a number of books, and that's, of course, not the way really, if you want to communicate with a lot of people now, but it's a long form writing that I find very satisfying. But basically, I think all of us who really care about science, who care about evidence-based reality, not just sort of fiction and making it up out of your own head, should try to talk about the importance of regarding evidence and evidence-based reality. And if you're young, use social media to do that. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, try and get them on the page saying that evidence matters. You can't just make it up out of your head and get anywhere. You'll be amazed at how little science understanding there is in the broader community. I've also been writing through the COVID thing. I've been totally involved in public communication and writing online essays, and you can find them on the website of the institute that's named after me, the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne. So they're now up to about 54, I think. Other question, if you are considering you wanted to have a career in infectious disease, how would you do that? Well, you'd complete a standard 4-year college degree. then there's a number of different paths you could follow. You could train to be a research scientist like me. There are a number of people actually in infectious disease who are very prominent who did train in veterinary medicine and then went across to be very prominent. That's not a very direct path if you want to work on human infectious disease, but many of the top influenza guys trained in that way. You can train to be a research scientist by going into a lab, doing coursework, completing a PhD, doctor of philosophy in microbiology, immunology, molecular biology, many institutions throughout the United States where you can do this. Alternatively, you could train in medicine and then specialize in infectious disease. So actually become a doctor who cares for patients. And of course, many MD researchers who specialize in infectious disease also have a PhD, MD, PhD. There's very good financial support for that in the medical science training programs. And the other alternative is you go to a school of public health to take a Master of Public Health. Many of the epidemiologists are more mathematically minded people or more social science minded people actually train that way to work with infectious disease. So that's where I'll leave the slides, and I'll try and get rid of these and go back to the screen. And I would just mention, though, that my son trained at Boston University and did his MD at Tufts University, and he's married to Susan Foley from Quincy, Massachusetts. And my grandson's at, Sam is at University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
That is in a small world, you know. And then
Yes.
yeah, and we have, when you talk us a little bit about the first book that you wrote about to inspire kids and on becoming a Nobel laureate. Actually, we purchased a couple of them after you recommended, and we raffled on one of them today in early morning portion. Yeah. So.
I'd been talking a lot on broadcast media and writing after the Nobel Prize and talking about science and evidence and how important it is. I'd been writing a lot for newspapers and magazines. This is back in the last decade of the 20th century, before social media got going in the way that it is now. So I've been doing a lot of that, and then a book editor who'd actually edited some prominent science books, in fact, suggested, she said, well, you write for a newspaper, it's a very transient and it just goes away very quickly and it's lost. But what you need to do is start writing a book. And so that led me to signing up to write a book. And the first book, the title is kind of facetious because it was suggested by the publisher, is called The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize. I mean, if you're interested in it, it's 2005, so it's a bit dated. But what I used that for was to talk about science and how it's done and what it's about and why it's different and why it's just a systematic way of looking at the world where you take measurements and numbers, then you publish a result so other people can repeat them. And that's really what's given us this science revolution that's been happening since the 17th century. And it's had such an enormous effect on improving human health and well-being. We live longer lives than at any time in human history. We live healthier lives. It's got a downside, though, because the industrial development that went with it and has made these lives possible, much of it is dependent on burning fossil fuels and releasing enormous amounts of greenhouse gas that have been stored in the earth for millions of years. And by releasing all that together and continuing to release it in large amounts, we've driven this problem of climate change, which is a very disturbing problem and is inexorable. And at some point, it will just, the greenhouse gases don't clear for 1,000 years at least. So this is just building up and building up. And at some point, we're really worried we're going to hit tipping points where it will get out of our control. So that's why I think the president is now initiating this major thing, getting China on board, because the United States and China are the world's two biggest greenhouse gas emitters. My country's, Australia's, also problematic because it's a fossil fuel exporter, and we need to stop doing that, though. We have a conservative government who's not very keen to do that. And but it's something that we all have to take on board, because this is the crisis that will continue to build and will be with us long after COVID is gone.
Yeah. And the other portion of the greenhouses is also, you know, all the chemicals that go into the oceans that also kills the coral reef. And the coral reef is the other part that helps to reconstruct the ecosystem.
Yes, we're losing the tropical coral reefs. They're suffering major bleaching events. This is largely due to the warming of the oceans. There are other, you know, coral is a life form. These are living organisms. And these coral reefs are interlinked ecosystems that support all sorts of life, marine life of various sorts. As the oceans warm, these reefs can't tolerate the heat. And they actually, the corals have, the color of the coral reef is not the color of the coral, it's the color of microorganisms, algae, that live on the coral. And as the reef warms, the corals kick out the algae and lose their color, and they bleach and they die because they need stuff that the algae makes to keep them healthy. So it's possible, and it looks as though we're going in that direction, that we are going to lose these magnificent coral reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which stretches for 1,000 kilometers or more. It's a massive, massive structure, and we may lose it. And this will be a colossal human tragedy in many, many respects. The other thing that's happening to the reefs is a lot of the carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere is being absorbed in the oceans. And what that does is acidify the salt water. And so we're already seeing effects, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, where acidified water is destroying the shells of oysters and life forms like that, which are calcified. And if the water is too acidic, they can't do that. So we stand to lose those life forms as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Dr. Doherty if have you heard of the Dr. Seuss story called The Lorax?
Yes, yes.
Well, okay. Well, just this morning at the first part of the festival, we had the Quincy Climate Action Network did a presentation, and they read that story online here. It was the first time I had seen the story, heard the story. And I mean, that really dramatizes what you were just talking about, how everything got destroyed, the trees that they cut down were not replaced, ruined the air. So it really, what you're talking about, that book really brought it to life.
Yes, yes, the logging, there's still massive logging that's going on, particularly in the tropical rainforests in South America, for instance, but also here and in Canada, is very disturbing because the trees take a lot of the carbon dioxide out of the air and they reprocess that and push out oxygen, which we have to survive. Also, there's a lot of the life forms in the ocean, the phytoplankton, are reprocessing carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. That's where we get our oxygen. We can't live without oxygen. If you look at the video, what's happening in India at the moment, because of their lungs being compromised by COVID, people are dying because they can't get oxygen. It's really a tragic situation, but we have to have oxygen. We're, as large air-breathing mammals, we're a very vulnerable species to changes in the atmosphere. And so we've created this situation with our big brains and our intelligence. We've now got to use our big brains and our intelligence to solve the problem. I see Elon Musk has just offered a prize of $100 million to people who can work out how to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, apart from using trees. There are technologies already that we could use solar and we'll extract it, but they're very, very expensive to run. But that's one possibility. But the main thing we need to do is stop putting this stuff into the atmosphere.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, if everybody has a questions,
Yes,
please feel free to ask send questions and also in the Q&A. Go ahead, Esther, please.
Hi. Good afternoon, Professor. With global heating and thawing of poles, are we facing the frostings of new microorganisms?
Are we expecting to encounter new microorganisms? I didn't quite get the question.
Yeah. Are we facing the frosting of micro? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, microorganisms, I tend to think of bacteria. we're not so worried from the human infectious disease point of view. We're worried particularly about one classification of bacterium, that's multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, which was a human scourge for centuries. Then we held it with antibiotics, but now due to the profligate use of antibiotics, particularly in some developing countries where you can just buy them from over the shelf without any prescription, we're very worried about multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. That's a real problem. You've had some of it in Boston. I think actually it's one of these situations where you can actually confine people by public order and require them to take the pills. And so with some homeless people where this has been a problem, you've actually had people confined. They've been let out during the day, but have to come back at nights to make sure they take their pills. So that's the bacterial disease. That's the one we're most worried about, but we're also worried about things like multi-drug resistant Staph aureus, which causes these terrible skin disease and necrotizing fasciitis, these horrible conditions. But with the viruses like COVID, now COVID is a coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus. This is a virus that's almost certainly come from bats through another mammalian species, maybe some wildlife species, into us. Now, the bats have a whole lot more of these viruses in them, and they could easily have more come out. Prior to 2000, the year 2000, there were 2 coronaviruses circulating in humans. They were what we call common cold coronaviruses. They cause, I think, about, I'm not sure whether it's 5 or 15% of common colds and so forth. And they've been circulating forever in us. They call colds and croup in little kids. After 2000, so there were 2 before 2000, after 2005 have crossed over. First is the original SARS virus, which killed about 800 people in East Asia and burnt out. Then there's the 2 more common cold ones have jumped across, and then CoV-2, the COVID-19, and then there's also another one in the Middle East called Middle Eastern Respiratory Syncytial Virus, which goes from probably from bats to camels to us. It kills about 30% of people. COVID, probably about 0.3% are dying. This kills about 30%. But it's not nearly as infectious. So these are very dangerous viruses. And so why are they suddenly starting to spread like this? Well, there are 2 factors, I think. One is the Chinese set up animal farms to farm these wildlife species to try and give more income to poor people. And I think if bats infected those populations, which were then sold in live animal markets in the cities like Wuhan, that may have been where this crossed over. The other thing is that China has become much more prosperous. Asia has become more prosperous. There's a lot of international air travel, passenger air travel out of those areas, which would carry these viruses. And these are countries which still have live animal and live bird markets, which are a very dangerous practice.
Okay. Now, thank you. Does that clarify your question, Esther?
Yes, and can I do another one, please?
Sure.
Will we be able to reverse global warming with the use of new energies?
With what?
Will we be able to reverse global warming with new energies? Can that be reversed?
We have to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that means going to other forms of energy. Renewable energy, it's good, but it's kind of expensive. Some countries do very well with it. For instance, Scotland, which is a part of an island nation, the British Isles, and has enormous wind, for instance, is a net energy supplier from wind energy. People are harnessing tides. Of course, there's solar, as we all know, but the majority of energy in the world is still generated from burning fossil fuels. The other technology that is clean in that sense, but not in another, and it's still very controversial in many countries, is of course nuclear fission. There are small modular reactors. We had a lecture from someone at MIT not so long back who said that you could run all the energy in Boston very easily with small modular reactors. You could basically have the nuclear waste for 100 years stored safely on something the size of a couple of tennis courts. So that may be what will happen in the United States. You'll see a lot more nuclear power rollout, but there has to be changes in legislation and so forth, as well as improvements in technology. The holy grail for all this would be nuclear fusion, where we reproduce the energy of the sun on Earth. The French are putting an enormous amount of effort into this. The tokamak at Princeton, for instance, was a major effort in that direction, but it's an extraordinarily difficult technical problem, and we don't know whether we can ever get it to work. We can get it to work on small scale. It's been said that nuclear fusion is 20 years ago, but they've been saying that for 20 years. So we don't know what will happen here. That would be the answer, though.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I got a question from the audience. Let's say, by the way, if anybody has questions, please use the Q&A button, or if you are in the panel, just raise your hand. The question is, when the body cells are attacked by the viruses, the immune system begins killing the infected cells.
Yes.
By studying mice, that way you provided some of the work that you did together with Rolf Zinker-Engel, proved in 1973 how the immune system recognizes virus cells. So the question that came is why the mice specifically, just because it works in mice, it's similar to the DNA to the humans, or any particular reason that makes the T cells to work in humans, does it applies also to animals?
Yes, the discovery was made in mice because what the discovery was is that when these immune T cells, the CD8 or killer T cells, kill virus-infected cells, they do so through recognizing a modified transplant molecule. The discovery was made in mice because geneticists, and this story starts in Boston, in fact, with the geneticists in Boston in the early part of the 20th century. And basically, some of them went down to Cold Spring Harbor, not to Cold Spring Harbor, to Mount Desert Island to found the Jackson Laboratory. And there was a geneticist there called George Snell, who trained in Boston, then went down there, and he was trying to understand immunity to cancer. And what he was doing was putting a cancer-causing chemical, methylcalanthine, on the skin of mice, creating cancers, and then transplanting these tumors into other mice to see whether those mice could reject them. He found they were very rapidly rejected, but he quickly realized it wasn't because of the cancerous change, it was because there were differences between the mice. And this is called the histocompatibility or transplant system. It's a system we seek to bypass when we graft a kidney or a heart or a lung. Well, we knew all about this from the work of George Snell and others in mice and also in humans. There was a man called Dosset in France. In fact, Dosset and Snell and Baruch Ben-Asra from Boston shared the 1980 Nobel Prize for this discovery. And basically we have this transplant system. So what we discovered, because we were able to use George Snell's mice, where he'd done all sorts of breeding experiments to isolate these various genes in various substrains of mice, we were able to use his mice that were used to study transplantation and cancer to show that our killer T cells in virus infections were also mapping through this transplant molecule. So the discovery was made in mice, but it applies equally to all vertebrate species, including humans. And so basically it's this modification of the transplant molecule that targets our T cells. And we know in humans, for instance, that some transplant molecules are very important for this, and some indigenous people who lack those are very susceptible to some infections. So it's a classic case of how a defined system, this transplant genetic system that George Snell and his friends developed, has informed what happens in humans and is the basis of our thinking about what happens in humans with cellular immunity. We're now studying this much more effectively in humans than we could back then because of the massive advances in molecular biology. We can take a single T cell out of the arm of a person and we can tell all the genes it's expressing. We can even tell its epigenetic profile. And my colleague, Catherine Kizieska in Melbourne, for instance, is doing wonderful work on this with COVID and with influenza.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. We have another question from the audience. It's coming from Cindy Sign. So in the book, The Lorax, there is emphasis on direct role that capitalism plays in destroying natural resources and causing health problems in both humans and animals. What are the thoughts on business regulation, and if that is possible, way to promote human conservation?
My personal view is that free open market economies where people can express themselves and they can be entrepreneurs and they can make money out of it, the way to go with solving this problem. We need human creativity and we need people out there getting stuff done. And part of the motive for that will be the profit motive. There may also be an altruistic motive. But what we need to change is the way that activity works. What we need to focus our thinking on, and that's not just the thinking of business, it's the thinking of citizens and voters, is on the idea that we need sustainability. We're using resources at such an enormous rate. We're chopping down the trees and all the rest of it, but the rate we're extracting fossil fuels, in a few hundred years, we wouldn't have any of those anyway, maybe much sooner than that. So we've got to move on beyond fossil fuels anyway. We're getting all the oil and we're getting all the gas and even all the coal. And eventually that's going to be gone and not too long in the future. But if we extract all that that's still left, we may not be here in the future because it will have driven global warming to very, very dangerous levels. So what we need to think in terms of is sustainability. Now, that's a very bad word to some people who describe themselves as conservatives. I'd say they're reactionaries. But basically, we need to develop sustainable economies. And these are economies, it's called a circular economy, where you reprocess everything. You don't discard, you reprocess. For instance, plastics that we use in all sorts of things can be reprocessed to make roads, to help to be a part of what makes roads. They can be reprocessed to go into plastic, into other plastics, of course, that's obvious, but they can also be reprocessed to make low emissions concrete. Concrete is a large emitter. So we need a circular economy to develop. And for a circular economy to develop, that has to change our attitudes with respect to consumption and to business activity. That doesn't mean there can't be very profitable business activity. It just needs to be refocused. And to do that, we may need regulation. I think personally, we need a price on carbon that's realistic, that reflects the environmental damage this is doing. That's politically very difficult, but even on the Republican side of politics, not the Republicans who've been in power, but the Republicans who had been in power and have been pushed out by the extreme right elements, there's been a very vigorous discussion of a net zero carbon tax, a carbon tax which would be levied and then given back in equal amounts to every citizen, which I think is a great way of doing it.
Yeah, then there should be taxation on carbon footprint, I think.
Yes, yes.
I think there is also another question from one of the. Go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering. Isn't if a wait, give me this. So if a nuclear plant, like, how will people like prevent a nuclear plant from creating a nuclear meltdown?
Yeah,
like,
that's a really good
dangerous,
question.
Like, maybe more than the fossil fuels, but is it more dangerous or less dangerous than the fossil fuels?
Yeah, that's a really good question, but you've got to look at American power and the American nuclear power plants. And except for as far as I know, and I may be wrong about this, except for an event at 3 Mile Island, where I don't think anybody actually died, but there was some release of radioactivity, I don't think anyone died in the US. There's been a lot of nuclear power generated over the decades. But what's happening is a number of different things. There's a lot of research going on and development going on developing what's called these small modular reactors, where if something went wrong, instead of having the explosion we had happen at Fukushima, they would automatically shut down. And so all the new power plants that people are thinking about would automatically shut down. Now, I'm not an authority on this, but there are people at MIT who are really good, who know a lot about it. And there's also another nuclear strategy, which instead of using fissionable plutonium, uses the radioactive element thorium. And thorium, there's also a lot of work going on in China, I believe, on thorium reactors. The advantage of thorium is the byproduct can't be used for weapons. And that's also a great advantage. So you can be sure that nobody's going to build nuclear power plants unless they think they're completely safe. But, you know, things can go wrong. So every possible fail-safe mechanism has to be built into them, if that's the way people go. I find, you know, I'm in Australia, which is a country that's the size of the continental United States, but instead of 300 million people, we've got 25 million. We're mainly desert. We have enormous amounts of sun, wind, all those things. We can go to renewable energy totally in this country, but that's pretty hard to do in the colder parts of the Northern Hemisphere, unless you've got enormous amounts of wind. So, you know, there'll have to be a lot of judgment, a lot of salesmanship to get people in the community to accept the idea, but we'll see how it goes. Or you will, you're young. I probably won't be around. I'll probably be pushed off by then.
Thank you.
May I ask another question?
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you. It's a question of a friend of mine that is a dentist, and she wants to ask you what is the relationship of the COVID virus with the oral mucosa or the periodontal tissue?
I don't know anything about what COVID does around the mouth. Okay. It's basically a virus that grows initially, we think, in the upper respiratory tract, right up in here. And so it will actually damage cells we call the sustentacular cells, apart from growing in the epithelial cells, where it attaches to the molecule ACE2, which is a molecule that's widely distributed throughout our body, so it can get into the cells. When it knocks off the sustentacular cells, it can destroy our sense of smell. And also it can also damage the sense of taste. So one of the early signs with COVID that we don't have, say, with influenza or other respiratory infections is the first thing you notice is your sense of smell is gone. And not all cases, but in many cases. Now, that also happens with things like flu. As your olfactory nerves get covered with mucus and inflammation and all the rest of it, but it doesn't usually lead to a permanent loss of smell. So that's one of the things with COVID. So it certainly does grow in those upper respiratory tract epithelial cells. And then it does two things. It can go deeper into the lung and it causes terrible lung damage, or unlike influenza, which stays in the lung, it can get into the blood. And that's where I think it's causing its worst damage. It's going around in the blood. It's infecting cells in the heart and the kidney and in the blood vessel walls, and it's causing a lot of blood clotting. So everyone that actually doesn't survive and actually comes to post-mortem, and I think this was discovered by a pathologist in New York who unfortunately died, there are little tiny clots that are stopping gas exchange in the lung. And also you can get a lot of strokes and stuff. So I think the worst parts of COVID, a lot of it's related to the bloodborne spread.
Thank you. And another question, it looks like in your book on a pandemic in 2013, and also what other people has talking about pandemics. It looked like you were seeing the future, but also it's something that happened almost like every 100 years in the world, right? Happens something in the early 1900s, happened after the First World War, and now it's after 100 years happen again. So when you wrote your book, so I'm sure that you have certain analysis that say, is something going to happen sooner rather than later. So what, what was in your thought, or how you were train of thought when you choose to write the book, and what you're trying to achieve on the people to read that book to get prepared?
Yeah, I was asked to write the book by Oxford University Press, who do a series called What Everyone Needs to Know. And someone came up with the idea they needed a book on pandemics. Now, I thought a bit about whether I should write it, in fact, because I'm not a public health specialist, and pandemics are largely in the public health community. These are the people who are doing the controls and all the rest of it. I'm a laboratory scientist, but I thought, well, if I write it, I'll write it a bit differently. And there have been other books like this. So I did write it. It's question and answer. It's called Pandemics, What Everyone Needs to Know. And it's other books in the series like The Catholic Church, What Everyone Needs to Know, sold many, many more copies because that's much more interesting. And at that stage, our main worry was influenza. We were worried about another influenza pandemic. We always have been. But what I missed when I wrote that was how quickly these coronaviruses are crossing over. I didn't know about the two common cold ones, for instance. I knew about the MERS virus and the original SARS virus. So it's highly likely, and there would be people in the public health area. These are what we call epidemiologists, who are actually looking at this question of the probability that we're going to get more of these events. And they will be using statistical, mathematical modeling type scenarios, just as the climate scientists do, to predict what will happen with climate science. They're the sort of people who train through schools of public health. They may have a medical degree, they may not, but the schools of public health actually train epidemiologists quite separately. And also the CDC trains epidemiologists. It has a wonderful program for that. So I think many of us are thinking that if we continue down the road we've been going, where there's massive international air travel and enormous numbers of people getting around the globe, especially from areas where there are live animal markets or live bird markets, which are a major risk with influenza, we will be seeing more pandemics at a much shorter time frame than every 100 years. So I think we should get ready for them. My thinking about the COVID pandemic is we should learn everything we can from it. What we've got with this is a global infectious disease in what's called a virgin soil situation. That is, no human beings have been infected with this before. Some of the common cold ones give you some cross-reactivities in that killer T cell response that I talked about, but otherwise we've got no pre-existing immunity to it. So we're either going to have to all get infected or we're going to get vaccinated. And we need to get to about 70%, 80% to actually stop the spread of the virus by what we call herd immunity. So I think we should study from every aspect what's happened here. We should study it from the economic aspect, the social aspect, the sociological aspect, and of course the infectious disease and science aspects. And we should ask ourselves, what are we doing and what is dangerous about what we're doing and why do we stop that? There are two things I think that would be very obvious, and that's one is we need a much better global agreement to be absolutely open about these events when they start. If you know the story of what happened early on in China, it's an authoritarian society. People were arrested if they spoke out, and that was a disaster. And any authoritarian society is a disaster. But of course, we also saw a disaster in the United States with very bad leadership through 2020 up till after the election, and totally confusing messages going out and people getting off into all sorts of crazy, crazy situations. So we can't have that. What we need is agreement internationally that as soon as one of these events is detected, there's immediate openness about it. It's immediately reported to the WHO, and every possible bit of information is given to the World Health Organization, which is the people who put this material out to everybody. And the other thing we need to agree is that as soon as something like that happens in a country, we immediately stop all passenger air travel out of that country until we feel we've got it under control. We would save billions of dollars by doing that. This is costing trillions and trillions of dollars. And the airline industries may feel victimized, but it would be much cheaper for everybody, including them, if we shut it down fast. Now, the other thing we can do as a preparation on a scientific front, we know how to make vaccines, and we made vaccines very, very fast for this, because we used massive new technologies that wouldn't have been available 10 or 20 years ago. One of them, the mRNA vaccination technology that's used in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that most Americans have got, wonderful vaccines. That technology was totally new in humans, and it was out there in a year. And we should give some credit to President Trump for the Warp Speed initiative that brought that forward. That was the good thing that he did on this. He actually helped push that forward. And of course, President Biden then rolled the vaccine out very rapidly and has been very aggressive about doing that. And everyone should get it. If you want this to stop, get the vaccine. It's not going to stop until at least 70, maybe 80% of people are immune. And the vaccine's giving better immunity than the infection. So get vaccinated. And basically, the other thing but it takes a year to make a vaccine, and it'll still take a year. They started to make it from day one as soon as they knew the sequence of the virus in early January. The Chinese released that quickly. That was published. From that day, they could start to make vaccine, because all you need to know is the gene sequence for a modern vaccine. But it still took about a year, because you have to test it and you have to be sure it's safe and all the rest of it. And even then, we've had some problems with some of the vaccines due to low-level safety concerns. With the AstraZeneca adenovirus vaccine, we're seeing about, I think it's about 6 cases in 1 million of bad blood clotting disease. That's really worrying. And also with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in the USA, though I think the incidence is lower with that one. Same sort of technology though. So, but what we need to have is chemical drugs, small molecules against these things. We have these for the AIDS viruses, the HIV viruses, and they work across all those viruses. So they're sort of global for that class of virus by targeting various parts of the virus replication pathway. And with HIV, you need at least 3 of them. People are on a cocktail, so you don't develop mutations that escape from one type mechanism. You need drugs targeting different mechanisms in virus replication. We have the same for influenza. They work on all the influenza viruses, everyone, new mutant strains, the B viruses, the A viruses. The only problem with influenza is you have to give them very, very early, which with COVID, the way we've diagnosed it with the PCR test, you could do. You could just test and then give people drug if they're positive, whether they're sick or not. So what we need to do is actually develop these types of drugs against all the classes of virus that are actually out there and could threaten us with the pandemic. We had them for influenza, but we need them for coronaviruses. We need them for what's called the henipaviruses that can cross over from bats and infect us, the filoviruses, the Ebola type viruses, and so forth. So we need a big global program, I think, probably philanthropically funded. We can't expect the drug companies to do it. There's no profit in it for them, but we need that. It'll be government and philanthropy to produce antiviral drugs that could be there and produced very quickly when we had an outbreak like this. It's remarkable to me, and I think it's been a failure, that we simply don't have those drugs now already for CoV-2. We had all this nonsense about things like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and all the rest of it. But I don't think that's what held it up. It seems to be either it's hard or the pharmaceutical companies weren't focusing hard enough on it.
The body systems, the skeletal system is well known, understood. The cardiovascular system, everybody knows what you're talking about when you're talking about that, the heart and the vessels. But when we talk about the immune system, what exactly are we referring to? It's not all in one place. What is the immune system?
The immune system is, yeah, no, with respect to your initial question, you know, we need levels of vitamin C, we need levels of zinc. Most people in Western society won't be deficient, but I heard Tony Fauci, who knows more about this than anyone, and of course you're all familiar with his face. I heard him say he's taking vitamin C and he's taking vitamin D. So the one thing I would take, certainly if your vitamin C might be one because it's an antioxidant, but I would make sure you're taking vitamin D, because that does have some effect, and it has been. There is some evidence that it is, if you've got adequate vitamin D levels, you are more likely to do well with COVID. So think about taking vitamin D. I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't give medical advice, but I'm taking 4,000 units a day of vitamin D. But in the main, if we're on a good diet, and you know, the people who have been dying in the United States are often, you know, poor people who have to go out there. Their diet is often poor and overweight, and because of eating at McDonald's and all the rest of it. So basically, yes, I think nutrition and having good nutrition is important, and maybe certainly vitamin D is one thing that's worth thinking about.
Good.
Especially with your skin color living in Boston.
Well, I take vitamin D anyway to help my bones. To supplement
yes, you take it for the
calcium that I
same reason.
take.
And
Yeah.
but it's the same thing. It also
Right.
helps a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
And what is the immune system exactly?
The immune system is an immensely complex system, and it's covering all sorts of things. We've got two great defense systems that react specifically with things that come from outside and from inside, for that matter, a pain in the stomach. And that's the central nervous system, the brain, that perceives things with consciousness. And it's a hardwired system. You know, we've got the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves. It's all connected by wires. And we have memory, which works by connections and established connected pathways. Wonderful research on that, and has won Nobel Prize and so forth. Now, with the immune system, it has no central processing unit like the brain.
Right.
It has organs which produce the basic immune cells. The thymus is one, and we have one in birds called the bursa, which produces the precursors of the B cells, the antibody-forming cells.
What was the name of that? What was the name of that?
The bursa of Fabricius. It's a little organ near the cloaca of the bird that actually produces the precursor of the antibody-forming cells. We don't have that. It's in the avian lineage, but not in the mammalian lineage. Okay. And basically that goes on in our bone marrow, we think. Now, the problem with the immune system is it's highly specific, but the memory all rests in the individual clones of cells, and the immune system is dispersed. So the cells are going all around the body. The T cells particularly are going, not only are they going around in the blood, they're going into our tissues, through our tissues, looking for changes and so forth, and coming back out of the blood. And I'm an immunologist, and one of the things we don't even really know how big the immune system is, because particularly if you're looking at the human immune system, you're only looking at the blood, unless you're looking at post-mortem material. And we don't know how many of those cells are out in the tissues. We don't know where they are and all the rest of it. So we know a lot about immunity. Immunological memory is what the basis of vaccination. We know about that, but we don't know how big it is, and we don't know a lot about its kinetics and dynamics. Now, there's wonderful stuff that's been done recently where we actually look through the skin into the responding lymph nodes where the immune response goes on. You know, the glands in your arm or the glands in your neck get sore when they're infection. That's where the immune response is happening. They're the lymph nodes, and there are technologies and basically where you can actually look through and actually start to see video microscopy of what's happening here. There's an enormous amount of work still to be done on the immune system and its understanding. And I've watched a lot of this. I've lived through a lot of it. I've been part of it. It's been enormously exciting. but there's no consciousness in the immune system, as we can't control it with our brains. And though, eating well and so forth is in a sense helping it, but it's not like the brain in that sense. But it is the other great system that deals with our environment specifically, with great specificity. A vaccine against COVID won't work against flu, and in fact, it won't. In time, there will be mutant forms of the virus where it won't work very, very well at all, and we'll have to make new vaccines.
Right. Okay, thanks.
That's wonderful. Great question, Kathy. Now, the other reason, well, you mentioned it's a great principle having the kind of almost like the backbone or the platform for vaccinations to be prepared for future pandemics, right? We have that platform saying, okay, once I have that defined, I can understand the variations that could happen, but I'm almost ready, just waiting for the, what I need to put the trigger to actually produce vaccinations for a particular virus, right? So that kind of platform, is that with the standard vaccinations, and you see a better way to approach that using the mRNA to say, okay, with that mRNA.
Yes. Well, the mRNA vaccines are very new. I think at maximum, people have been given 2 doses. They're being given 1 shot and then another one 3 or 4 weeks later, depending on which vaccine it is. And they're wonderful vaccines. We've noticed with the Pfizer vaccine, the first one that was out there, that you get some side effects with the first one, you get much worse side effects with the second one. So that could not, maybe it's not against the mRNA, maybe it's against the material that's packaging it. The Pfizer one is packaged in nanoparticles, lipid nanoparticles, fat. And it's also got some other stuff in there as well. So it may be that we'll have to change the formulation or something. We don't know how many times we can give this. But if these mRNA vaccines can be given multiple times and made to counter other diseases, I think we'll see them becoming very, very prominent, particularly against influenza. Now, with the COVID vaccines, these vaccines have been made, and it took a year to put them through clinical trials and get the regulatory authorities, FDA, to approve them, and then to start getting, and while that was going on, because it was a pandemic situation, everything was truncated. People weren't waiting to see what the results were and whether it was approved. They were starting to manufacture these vaccines ahead of time as soon as they knew they looked good. So everything was speeded up because of the pandemic. Now, when it becomes necessary, for instance, to take, say, the mRNA spike protein COVID vaccine made by Pfizer or Moderna or some of the newer companies and change it to deal with a variant strain, I expect that we'll do the same as we do with influenza, because we reformulate the same type of influenza vaccine every year to deal with mutants. And that's a very quick approval process by the regulatory people. So I don't think we'll have to go through that again as we reformulate these vaccines to deal with other variants of this particular virus. Now, what the testing, we will though, if we start to make mRNA influenza vaccines or against something else, we still have to go through that for the initial phase. And we'll see how that works out. It'll be a lot up to the regulators like FDA. They want to make sure that what they're doing is safe and that nobody's going to be badly affected by the vaccine.
Now, do you think AI, artificial intelligence, can help to accelerate, the production of those new vaccines?
That's really, my age at 80, that's a bridge too far for me. I'm sure there are people who can talk authoritatively about it, but I can't really with any degree of authority. I'm not sufficiently across it. I think we do think some of very smart tricks and so forth. I think the molecular tricks that make the mRNA vaccine are very, very clever. But, I tend to think of things, in reality, real products, real molecules. But I think there are other people who can talk about this who could give you insights. And it's obviously a very interesting area.
Excellent, thank you. There's another question from Claudia. Say, we know that the vaccine were approved on emergency. Do you think that the vaccine will be adjusted in the near future, given the resistant changes in the evolution?
Yes, the Pfizer vaccine gives you very high levels of protective antibody, but with some of the mutants the vaccine is proving 4 to 6-fold less effective. Because of the high levels of antibody, it's still actually stopping people getting really sick and dying if they're infected with those mutants. We've got a bad mutant from South Africa, and there's another one from Brazil. I think there's a mutant virus that's taken over in New York, for instance. And I don't know as much about that. And of course, it's a problem in what's happening in India, which is catastrophic at the moment. So, so with the mutants, we'll have to reformulate these vaccines. Now, the companies, I think, are already doing that. They're producing mutant variants of the SARS-CoV-2 spike, where these are all directed against a single protein of the virus. When in the vaccine, you've got just one protein of the virus. In the infectious virus, you've got lots of other proteins doing lots of other things we don't really understand very well, and some of them are very bad things. So the vaccine is much safer. But yes, we will see reformulated vaccines being put out there, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Well, probably as you mentioned, when the people with the humanity reaches 80% of vaccination, probably those variations may start to reduce the number of variations that come down the road.
Yes, well, what the virus has been mutating on what we call in a naive population, people who haven't been infected before. So the mutant viruses that have been emerging have been the ones that transmit better, and in some cases they cause more severe disease. Now, once we get a lot of antibody there, we will see what we call the virus developing what we call escape mutants. That is, they'll no longer be handled by the vaccine. But in order to avoid the vaccine, we think they will have to suffer what we call a fitness cost. And so whether we'll see vaccine-resistant mutants emerging the way they do with flu, but there are enormous numbers of mutants come off with flu, many more than with this. Whether we'll see viruses becoming milder because they've suffered a fitness cost, we don't know. That's what happens with influenza. When you get a very bad influenza, the next year won't be as bad, even if the virus is still circulating. But whether it will happen with COVID-2, it's all a big experiment.
Right. Another question here. So thank you. Thank you to the answer. Okay. I have another question to say. Well, I think when you mentioned already have the summit and in Washington D.C. So do you think that rather than having politicians or presidents or kings or whatever giving direction to the countries on what the people needs to do to prevent the expansion or to take care, rather than have to delegate to the scientists and say, as part of the agreement, say everybody to agree, say, hey, when the situation like this happen, a health situation happen, really the scientists are the ones who have to tell the people what need to get done, and then just use the communications media to publish what needs to be done, rather than just a party that say, I think this is right, versus sustainable knowledge.
What we know about pandemics, particularly from the AIDS pandemic, that's still going. I mean, it kicked off in 1981, and we still have a global AIDS pandemic going. What we know is that it's really important that political leaders give a very consistent science-based message. So we need the political leaders to listen to the scientists, and if possible, we need both sides of politics putting out exactly the same message. We've had that in Australia. We've got Conservative, and we've got the other side is the Labor Party, which is actually a socialist, Fabian Socialist Party, which is to the left of the Democrats in most things. So you need both sides of politics putting out the same message. If you've got a president with the bully pulpit, you need the president saying exactly what the scientists say, and this is what we got to do. And that, of course, is what you lacked in the United States in the year 2020, and I think a lot of people died as a result of that. Now you have the opposite situation. But the other thing you need to do is to get all the social leaders in society on the same page. And countries like Senegal in Africa with the AIDS pandemic would handle it very well, because not only did they have the political leadership saying the same thing, they had the military, who were also powerful, saying the same thing. And they had, it's a Muslim country, so they had the imams, the religious leaders in the Muslim community saying the same thing. And so you need all those influential groups persuaded and shown the evidence and talked to with respect by the scientists, saying the same thing to everybody. Now, that, again, that consensus is fractured in, to some extent in the United States, and we've had some people on the evangelical side really saying crazy things. And that's dangerous, and it puts their community at danger. And if their community is at danger because it's an infectious disease, everybody else is at danger. So we need everybody on the same page. I mean, there's a lot of obsession with the restriction of freedom here. Freedom not to wear a mask when people tell you to do so or ask you to do so. But quite frankly, I think we need to think of our freedom also in the context of mutual respect. And if the medical community, the medical doctor, is asking us to wear a mask when you come into their practice, that's a matter of respect. And really, if you don't respect that, the only freedom you're exercising is the freedom to be a total jerk.
Right. Yeah. You know, the freedom finishes when the freedom of the other person starts.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, for example, New Zealand or Iceland, they did a fantastic job gathering the scientific community, understanding what was the problem, and then the social media communicators to express in a consistent manner what the countries need to do. It's probably aligned with what you were describing, and probably that's what is very low rates in New Zealand and as well in Iceland. Because they, you know,
Yes.
put it that way, saying, you know, we're not the government clearly said we're not an experts in managing pandemics, but let's get the scientists to help us to manage it, and then we get the communication people to tell what the scientists say, rather than us.
Well, our country is an island, so we stopped the flights from China very quickly, and because we're an island, we've been able to control it well, and we have a conservative national government. We're a federated system like the United States. All the state premiers, the equivalent of state governors in the United States, have been on the same page. There's been a national cabinet. Some of them are from more the left of politics, some of them more the right. They've all said the same thing, done the same thing. The prime minister, who's the head of government, it's a parliamentary system, not the presidential system in the United States, has been saying the same thing. The conservative side of politics has done exactly the right thing here. Unfortunately, they're not doing the right thing with climate change. They're not listening to the scientists. They've shown they can listen to the scientists on the COVID front. They simply can't listen to the scientists. They can only listen to powerful business interests on the business front, which is very unfortunate and dangerous.
Thank you. That's right. It has been a great conversation. We're about to wrap it up, but unless anybody has other questions, but also if it's possible just to share a little bit about your book, the new book that you're releasing this year. Just give us a
well, I've been for the last year since this started. I'm no longer running a laboratory. I'm 80 years old. I think that those research dollars should be available to the younger and more energetic people. So I've been phasing out of actually doing the science, but I've been doing a lot of science communication. So my role through this pandemic has been science communication. I've done a lot of that for more than 20 years since the Nobel Prize. I'm reasonably good at it, and that's what I've been doing. And so I've been doing what I'm doing now, Zooming and Skyping and so forth across the planet, also within Australia, and appearing on various broadcast media, interviews, being interviewed by journalists from places as diverse as South America and Africa. So I've been doing public communication. At the same time, I'm at the Peter Doherty Institute, which is named after me, which has been very effective in this pandemic. We brought together basic scientists and the diagnostic scientists and the clinical scientists in a structure some 5 years back. It's a new institute. And we have all the infectious disease work in our region located in this institute. We set up the tests and we do the clinical work and we do the basic science. And that's been very successful. So the Peter Doherty Institute, if you log into that on online, you'll see I've been writing a weekly essay called Setting It Straight, which is about all things infection and immunity. Some of them are pretty related to Australia. They're Australia focused, most of them aren't. And basically they're now up to number 54. I think the first 42 of them are going into a print book, along with about another 25, 30,000 words that will come out mid-year, called An Insider's Plague Year. At the moment, it will be published in Australia. Whether any international publisher will want to pick it up, I don't know, but it will be published around July.
Thank you so much. Really good. We really appreciate the time that you dedicate to us and sharing that. Do you have any inspiration words for? We have some students in the audience that you would like to share. And
Well, I'm an old guy now. I was born in 1940, and I lived through the Second World War, and I'm sort of on the way out. Obviously, the future is with you guys who are at school now. The future is with your attitudes to life and with how seriously you take the issue of evidence and what's happening and how much and how quickly you can change. I think there are some things you need to think about, and that is when you start your training in college or universities, what do you want to do with your life? I mean, as someone said, there's a rocking chair test. When you're my age, I'm not sitting in the rocking chair on the porch yet, but I could end up doing that. When you're my age, as you rock there in the rocking chair and are not doing much anymore, can you reflect on your life and say, well, I did something that was worthwhile, and I can feel good about that. So there's that test. But basically, I think one of the things you need to think about is we need to vote. I mean, not everybody votes, and we have compulsory voting in Australia, but still too many young people don't vote. Think about politics, think about the political process, look at the politicians. When registered to vote as soon as you can. No political party will likely be perfect for you, but think of the least worst alternative and vote for them. And if the politics is bad, try and change it. Now, do I need to say that in Quincy, which I think probably is an area that certainly was heavily involved in democratic politics historically, whether that's still true or not, I don't know. But the political process is important. Democracy is important. We've got to preserve democracy. There are very powerful forces against the preservation of democracy. And we saw a terrifying situation in the United States with the invasion of the Congress. That was appalling, and that should never have happened. And the people have to be held to account for what they did. I hope the people who drove it will also be held to account. But democracy is important. Preserve it, and the way you preserve it is to vote.
Thank you. Very inspirational.
Manuel,
yes.
I have two things I just wanted to say. I wanted to say, Ed Shapiro, you could not have gotten a better speaker for us. It is so timely and so important, and I really thank you. It's been great getting a chance to talk to Dr. Peter Doherty. And Peter, I wanted to say to you that I'm going to check within the next couple of days with the library here in Quincy to see if I can get one of your books out. And if they don't have one, I'm going to have a word with them about that and tell them they should get some books of Dr. Peter Doherty in there.
The Beginner's Guide book, the Pandemics book, The Knowledge Wars, which I think is probably the most important book I've written. They're available either as print or ebooks from Amazon.com.
Okay.
And some of them are very, very cheap because nobody much buys them. So
yeah, we purchased, as I mentioned, we purchased some, and we raffled one of them today in the earlier sessions. One of your books.
Okay. Okay. Well, nice to talk.
Yeah, but thank you so much. Really
and
appreciate
be
time.
safe and be well, and everyone should get the vaccine.
I'd like also to acknowledge a role of our Manuel Barroso, whose initiative it was to invite today's Nobel laureate, our future mind leader. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you,
I'll say
Ed.
goodbye at
Really
this
appreciate it.
stage.
You, Ed.
So thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.